Well, after his meeting with Donald Trump in Singapore, Kim Jong-un has been in Beijing. This is a third meeting now that he's had with China's President Xi Jinping. It is a long way from the reclusive leader Kim Jong-un was just a year ago. But what does all of this mean for what we see as the global political order, the shift in geopolitics around the world? Kevin Rudd is the former Prime Minister of Australia. He's now the President of the Asia Society Policy Institute in the United States. I spoke to him earlier. Kevin Rudd, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be on the program, Stan.
Kim Jong-un has wrapped up another meeting with Xi Jinping. This is 3 meetings now in 3 months. What's your read on what's really taking place here?
Well, something significant is there's been a drought for 5 years in terms of Kim Jong-un's welcome in Beijing, and suddenly we've got 3 meetings in a little more than 3 months. The bottom line is China, firstly, does not want to lose North Korea from its sphere of strategic influence. That's sort of carved deep into the psychology of China's political and military leadership. But secondly, on the immediacy of it, the Chinese are obviously angling for an easing of UN sanctions and non-UN sanctions as they relate to the North Koreans in order to, as it were, lighten the load domestically from Kim Jong-un at this stage. So I think that's what this visit's been about.
How does this factor into the US-China relationship as well? Are we seeing a bit of bargaining potentially here? We know there are strains over trade. Is this something that China says, well, listen, if we can do a deal on this, I can get North Korea to do that? Is this all part of the shifting, moving pieces of this chessboard?
Historically, the Chinese tend to keep these things in relatively defined baskets. Obviously, we have a trade war now unfolding with the United States, and that is of itself significant. As to whether it's more damaging to America or China remains to be seen. On the national security front, the Chinese will always put that at the top of their priority list, particularly when it relates to a neighbouring state like North Korea. And they'll be seeking to maximise an outcome on the Korean Peninsula, which, as I said before, keeps the North Koreans within China's strategic orbit. Secondly, slowly but surely, from China's perspective, weans the South Koreans away from their reliance on their security relationship with the United States. And thirdly, over time, on the way through, I think, try to use whatever influence they have remaining in Washington to cause the Americans to adopt a more reasonable view from their point of view on the sanctions regime applied by the UN Security Council.
Mr. Rudd, it's been over a week now since the Kim-Trump meeting, and there have been various assessments of it that potentially this is a breakthrough, potentially laying a platform for peace. To the other end, that the United States, Donald Trump, gave away too much to get too little in return. You've had this time to mull over this. What now is your assessment of the meeting and the potential for something significant going forward?
The bottom line, Stan, is it's still too early to tell. The American team of negotiators is quite a good one. Secretary of State Pompeo is a smart operator, and the team around him from the State Department, I think, are good and first-class negotiators. So the attitude I've always taken to this is, look, Trump is Trump. You know, he's not a classical diplomat. He's opened up this new track with the North Koreans. There is a negotiating process underway, and it's better to have negotiations than to have none. But I think the truth test will certainly lie in the next 6 months as to whether the definition of denuclearization has teeth in it or whether it's simply a paper tiger, frankly. And I suspect ultimately, and I could be proven wrong here, is that what will get thrown up onto the table is some proposal, maybe backed by the Chinese, but also advocated by the North Koreans, which provides Donald Trump with an outcome on ICBMs, that's intercontinental range missiles, but leaves North Korea's short-range missiles and medium-range missiles in place. I doubt that would be acceptable to the bulk of the US administration, but that rest of the administration would also be fearful that Donald Trump, going into the midterms, may wish to cut a deal along those lines.
How do you read all of this and make sense of an emerging global order? Are we shifting from the rules-based order to a return of the great power politics?
Well, Stan, I think it's important to identify the big change drivers here that are washing over the world as we speak it, including the rules that we by and large set in 44 and 45 coming out of the Second World War. The big change drivers are, of course, the rise of China, and China no longer being just a global economic power, but increasingly, as my friend and colleague Gareth Evans wrote recently, exercising a foreign policy influence in the world and a strategic policy influence in the world as well. This is a big shift. Number two, of course, is what we've just been discussing, which is not so much the relative decline of American power, but a new American nativism, a new American nationalism, and a selective form of US isolationism. This too is new. But what we don't know, Stan, is how permanent that change in the United States body politic is going to be. Is it for the next 2.5 years? Is it for the next 6.5 years? Or are we looking at a more permanent trajectory? And the final big change driver, which we need to be mindful of, is the enormous disruptions occurring with all our democracies as the new technologies disrupt labour markets, make social cohesion more difficult, lead to a rise in local xenophobia and the rise of local nationalisms as well. So these are the things washing over all of us. Making sense of it is the challenge for national political leadership.
What does that mean for a middle power like Australia, who is biggest trade relationship with China, closest strategic relationship with the United States, and frankly at the moment some tensions in that China relationship?
I think that's true, Stan. I think on the question of China's grand strategy, I've spoken on this recently. I delivered an address at West Point, the US Military Academy, on Xi Jinping's worldview. And part of that worldview in our hemisphere, in the Asian hemisphere, is in fact to incrementally, over time, push the United States out of East Asia and the West Pacific. The Chinese have basically stated this as their goal for a long, long time. And they're deploying as much diplomacy and military hard power and soft aid power as possible to do that. Now, we in Australia, as a parliamentary democracy from the Western tradition and a long-term ally of the United States, do not want to see that happen. That's the first factor. The second with the Americans is I think it would be imprudent, notwithstanding the unpopularity of President Trump within Australian domestic politics, for the Australian political community to make some rash or early conclusion that the United States is sliding out the door backwards. We should wait and watch very carefully what happens with the unfolding dynamics in US domestic politics. So what do we do in the meantime? One, using the US military alliance bilaterally to reinforce with all of our friends in Washington the paramount importance, notwithstanding the predilections of the president, to maintain the solidity of its alliance relationships around the world. I think, two, we also have an opportunity and a responsibility through the position which, frankly, our government secured back in 2008 as a member of the G20 to work with the French, the British, the Germans, countries like the Canadians and the Mexicans, countries like the Japanese, the Indonesians and the South Koreans, the democracies, if you like, of the world and supporters of the global liberal international rules-based order, to forge common positions within the G20 on maintaining the architecture we have given birth to over the last 6 to 7 decades. We shouldn't simply kiss goodbye to that. And the final one, much maligned in Australian domestic politics, is what we do as a strong voice in defence of the order in the councils of the United Nations itself. It's through these three sorts of mechanisms that I believe Australia can use an effective regional and global voice, and bilateral one with Washington.
Mr. Rudd, always good to talk to you. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Good to be with you, Stan.